Hey, welcome to lesson 4.2, Congruent Triangles. Our objective for today is for students to be able to identify if two triangles are congruent. So what are congruent triangles? Triangles are congruent, all right? We know if two triangles are congruent. And remember, congruent means like the same size and shape. Same size and shape. Just a little reminder for you. If all the sides and angles are equal measures. And that makes sense. So if I have two triangles and all the sides are the same length and all the angles are the same degree measure, then probably the two triangles are congruent. All right? And not probably, they definitely are. So what we're really talking about here is not if they're congruent, but can we prove that two triangles are congruent beyond any reasonable doubt? If we were going to a judge and he said, prove to me that these two triangles are congruent, your case would be, well, I could show you that all three sides are the same in the two triangles and all three angles are the same. So therefore, judge, these two triangles are definitely congruent. So basically, you're making a case here. So my question to you is, how could you prove that these two triangles in front of you are congruent? And you might say, oh, the sides are the congruent and the angles are congruent, but that's not specific enough. I want you to tell me which sides are congruent and which angles are congruent. So to do that, let's write out each one, okay? So I know side AC, okay? This side, AC, over here, is congruent to side DO, okay? So that's one side that's the same. I also know that side AT is congruent, that's AT over here, congruent to OG, which is over here, to side OG. And finally, I know side CT is congruent to side DG. All right, look, they're both 5 feet. So CT is the same length, or it's congruent to DG. So I've just proved that the sides are congruent because those sides are all the same length. But now I got to also prove that the angles are congruent. So looking over here, I know that angle C, which is 58 degrees, is congruent to angle D because they have the same measures. I know angle A is congruent to angle O because they're both 90 degrees, so they must be the same. And angle T is congruent to angle G because they're both 32 degrees. So now I've just made my case to the judge. All three sides are the same in both triangles, and all three angles are the same in both triangles, so I know beyond any reasonable doubt that these two triangles are congruent. So triangle CAT is definitely congruent to triangle DOG. Cat is congruent to dog. See what I did there? Cool. And the reason I know that these two triangles are congruent is because corresponding sides and angles are congruent. So just to go through another example of this, okay? I'm looking at these two triangles and I want to prove that, once again, let's prove that ABC, which is this triangle over here, is congruent to DEF. All right, and that means congruent. Now to prove in front of a judge that these two triangles are congruent, I need to show that all three sides are congruent and all three angles are congruent. So we come down over here, all right? And look, so if I'm looking at these two triangles, I see that side BA is 4 inches and side ED is also 4 inches. So they're congruent. So that's one side that's definitely congruent, BA and ED. All right? I also see that side AC is 7 inches. That's over here. And so is DF. It's also 7 inches. So that is also congruent. So DF is 7 inches. So those two are congruent. And then BC is 6 inches and EF is 6 inches. So they are also congruent. So BC and EF are congruent. BC and EF are congruent. All right. So that's half my proof. I proved all the sides are congruent. Now I've got to show which angles are congruent. Now, even though the degree measures aren't here, I have these markings. And remember, these little arc marks show that two angles are congruent. So over here, A and D both have this one mark. So I know angle A is congruent to angle D. That mark shows me that's congruent. I know angle B is congruent to angle E because they both have this double arc right here. And angle C is congruent to angle F. So now that I've showed that all three sides are congruent and all three angles are congruent, I know beyond any reasonable doubt that ABC is congruent to DEF. Uh-oh, class is over. Because corresponding sides and angles are congruent. Okay, second problem. We're going to prove that these two triangles are congruent. Once again, to prove that two triangles are congruent, we just have to show that all three sides and all three angles are the same. So, let's check out this example. We have our two triangles over here, and we know that all three sides are congruent because they have these marks over here. So let's write that down. We see that the sides are congruent, so we know that RA, which is this side right here, is congruent to BD because they have that mark over there. So RA is congruent to BD. All right. We know that AP is congruent to DO because they have these double marks. They both have the same double marks, so AP is congruent to DO. Don't forget my little lines to say that it's a line, and then we know that RP is congruent to BO. So RP is congruent to BO. All right, those are our three sides. Now let's look at our angles. Well, I know that angle R is congruent to angle B because they're both 25 degrees. So these two angles are congruent. So angle R is congruent to angle B. But then I'm looking at these other angles and I'm like, whoa, I don't see any more congruent angles. But hey, wait a minute. If we look back at our last lesson, we remember that since these are both missing an angle, well, maybe these missing angles are the same. We don't know. So let's find the third angle for both of these first. So to find the third angle, if you remember, it's just 180 minus 25 minus 120. And if I do that, I would get 35 degrees. All right, that goes in over here. And let's try this guy. If I do 180, let's find the missing angle, minus 25 minus 35, I get 120 degrees. And look at that. They are all the same. So now I can prove that all three angles are the same. So I now know that angle A is congruent to angle D, right? Because I found my third missing angle, and I know angle P is congruent to angle O. So there, I showed that all three sides are the same, or congruent, and all three angles are congruent, and now I know without any doubt in my mind that triangle RAP is congruent to triangle BDO. Just magic, like magic. And the reason I know this because corresponding sides and angles are the same. Beautiful. All right, let's move on to the next part of our lesson. This is a little different. So we're going to go backwards here. So if the last part of the lesson, what you saw was two triangles, right? And you had to prove that they're congruent. Now what we're going to start off here is we know that they're congruent. So what do we know about the triangles? You see, so I already know that my triangles are congruent. What does that tell me about the two triangles? All right? Now one note about this before we go on. We're going to be writing congruent statements here. And when you write a congruent statement about two triangles, the order of the letter matters. The order matters. That's the most important thing here. Now what do I mean by that? Triangle BEN is congruent to triangle ROB. All right? These two triangles are congruent. But since the order matters, I actually know some other things. Like, for example, I know that angle B is congruent to angle R, right? Because those are both in the first position. So angle B is congruent to angle R. The order matters. I also know that angle E is congruent to angle O, right? Because these are both the second letter here. So these angles are going to be the same. So angle E is congruent to angle O because they're both the second one. And finally, I know that angle N is congruent to angle B. So angle N is congruent to angle B. Oh, sorry, I should have put 2 here. And angle N is congruent to angle B. The order that I write these in matters. I can't just put them in a random order. All right? B has to be congruent to R, E is congruent to O, and N is congruent to B. Now, furthermore, I know this also tells me, this statement tells me what sides are congruent. So, the example here, I know that BE is congruent to RO. So BE is right here. That's congruent to RO. And look, they do look the same here, so this, you know this, right? I also know that EN, hold on, let's try this. EN is congruent to OB. So EN is congruent to OB. So EN is over here, and OB is over here. And finally, let's erase all this stuff because it's getting a little too cluttered. I know that NB is congruent to BR, and that's the hardest one. These two outside ones are the same. So NB is congruent to BR. All right, NB right here, 2, 3, is congruent to BR. And that is how it's done. So these orders, so if I were just to look at this congruent statement, all right, I can know which angles are congruent to each other, which sides are congruent to each other, because the order of these matters. Okay, so let's take a look at this example, okay? We know that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, all right? With that information, I'm going to fill in the missing sides and angles for this triangle. Now the first thing to do, and this is just for practice, let's say which sides are the same and which angles are the same. So first off, we know that angle A is congruent to angle D, all right? Angle B is congruent to angle E, and angle C is congruent to angle F, all right? Okay, so since I know angle A is congruent to angle D, I know A is here, and I know D is here, I know this is also 67 degrees. Since angle B is congruent to E, B is 92, that means E is 92 degrees. And C is congruent to F, so since C is 21 degrees, I know F is 21 degrees, all right? This just tells me which angles are congruent to each other. Now, secondly, I know what sides are congruent to each other based on this statement. So I know that AB is congruent to DE, right? AB is congruent to DE. I know that BC is congruent to EF, all right? BC is congruent to EF. And don't forget the outside ones. I know AC is congruent to DF. So AC is congruent to DF. So we just fill these in. Since AB, which is 17, AB is 17, I know DE is also 17. And I know what you're thinking, that doesn't even look the same, but too bad, that's what it says. BC is congruent to EF, so BC, which is right here, is congruent to EF, which is 20. And then AC is congruent to DF. AC, which is 23, is congruent to DF, which is 23. And that's how you fill it in. Just remember, this statement, the order matters. All right, finally, with this congruent statement, we're going to mark these two triangles, all right? I'm going to mark all the congruent sides and angles. So let's start with the angles. From this congruent statement, triangle MNO is congruent to triangle JKL. I know that angle M is congruent to angle J, right, because they're both the first one. I know angle N is congruent to angle K, because they're both the second one. And I know angle O is congruent to angle L. All right, angle's done. Now I also know that MN is congruent to JK, so MN, hold on, MN is congruent to JK. I know NO is congruent to KL, NO is congruent to KL, so NO and KL. And I know MO, which is this last one, is congruent to JL, those outside ones. So MO is congruent to JL. Perfect, that's how you marked it. We marked the congruent sides and angles. All right, final thing. We're going to do without the triangles this time. All right, so if I know that triangle MNO is congruent to triangle JKL, I know that NO is congruent to what? Well, since NO are the last two letters, I know it's congruent to KL. Also, I know that angle O is congruent to angle, well, if this is the last one, I know it's going to be angle L, because they're both the last ones, right? Now, in this case, I know that triangle GAP is congruent to triangle XYZ. So, in this case, PG is congruent to, well, XY, because those are both on the ends. And I know angle Y, which is in the middle, is going to be congruent to angle A, because that's also in the middle. And that's it. All right, guys, that's all you have to know about congruence. We know how to prove triangles are congruent. We know how to write these congruent statements and all that jazz. So remember, guys, one, Mr. Elizondo can bench press 420 pounds, and also he once ate a lizard with his mouth. And two, Fatumata, the student, she's the coolest. Peace.